So, what I wanted to do for the purpose of our sort of introductory session today was to scope things out. Usually, this is a course which I sort of take, which is spread across 3 months in a full semester mode. It's a pretty rigorous, extensive course which looks at different verticals of late developing economies. The idea is to first get a basic framework in place to understand what political economy or the context in which we define political economy landscapes. And for that, there are introductory readings that help you get a perspective of the nature of association between nation states, market institutions, and the evolution of those, which is contextually very different from each country and each part of the world. But what we are focusing in terms of our spatial concentration are late developing economies. And the word late is in the field of political theory or political economy used in context to post-colonial nation state economies, right? And the context of not just India, but countries like Nigeria, Brazil, Korea, many of those that have had an extensive or long history of colonialism would have institutional growth seen in a very different light as compared to economies that have had less of a colonial past, or what you would say the degrees of colonial rule might have been in very different form and shapes. You have examples from countries within different parts of Africa, where if you look at the case of Botswana, for that matter, where the extensive of local institutions and tribal institutions more or less successfully never allowed colonial forces to have an extensive, deep-rooted institutional form of rule, which would have otherwise allowed for a lot of change in the growth trajectory of each of the institutional development processes. So, what we want to do is basically take the first 2 to 3 sessions to understand the theoretical or the conceptual context in which we are situating the political economy lens. Um, in context to looking at not just, I mean, before we start looking at any specific country, what we want to do is understand the nature of engagement of the form of nation states and find some kind of a useful framework that can help you situate a particular country based on its sort of post-colonial nation state evolution. And this may be true of not just of what you would define as part of, in modern terms, the global south or the spectrum of that particular space, but also more broadly in terms of analytically developing a cohesive framework. So yeah, there's some useful, I think, references. There are a few readings you would have got access to. So what I want to do today is to basically talk a little bit about the course, what it seeks to do, what it doesn't do, because it's also important to understand what we can feasibly cover and encapsulate over a period of next few weeks, 4 to 5 weeks of learning. There are very different ways in which I was telling at the beginning in my sort of exchange with Asia that most of the times the course that I have taught has been mostly in an in-person mode, and it is a lot more. There's a lot more you can do in in-person mode in terms of group exchanges and exercises. I have somehow retained the nature of engagement of those group exercises, keeping in mind that the amount of learning and the nature of learning from the course is likely to be much more um, different and diverse when there is engagement amongst a very uh, diverse cohort in class. So that is something which I'm hoping that you would be doing that engagement from your own lens as the course evolves. But today, what I want to do is just start a little bit in terms of giving you a perspective of the key questions that we are going to be looking at in context to explaining the conceptual framing of the course. Uh, the other aspect is to talk a little bit about the manual, which you would have seen as a document. I think most of you have got. Uh, just wanted to cross check if you received an email with the announcement note that was shared a few days back. Did you receive any email, or just when the announcement was made, or was it all just on Brightspace? And when you access Brightspace, you can. There used to be usually, I think, a process where an announcement is made, you all get some kind of a communication, right? Which is uh, of a
There
note,
was
because
no, there was no announcement. I just kept on checking Brightspace until I saw the information.
Okay, all right. So maybe then it's better that, because I have all of your email addresses, is that I send a separate email, which will help you, I think, get because earlier when an announcement note was made, the email would automatically go to everyone. So that's fine. I can do that. So I'll walk you
Okay,
through the course
sorry to
manual.
interrupt, Professor. I did
Sorry.
receive an email, so I'm not sure if
Okay, you
there's
did.
something
All
to
right.
do with the settings. Yeah.
All right. So I'll check once that if there's anything to do with the settings, or otherwise the safer option always is just send an email also. So I'll do the double part of that. So the information on manual and sort of what we are doing across weeks, I think, is critical to give you a perspective on how the course also evolves. In the first couple of weeks, we're looking at a lot on specific readings that are concept heavy, or giving you a more dense outlook towards a little bit of to get a sense jargon of what and how you understand institutions, nation state formations, and what are the critical theories around that, to be able to make sense out of it. And one of the persons you read more in that initial lens is Atul Kohli, who's a political economist in Princeton, and it's his book, in fact, State-Led Development, which is mentioned as one of the first introductory readings. There will be passages and chapters from different texts that you will read. I mean, the reading assortment for the course is shaped in a way that the course itself is what would be designed as a reading seminar. It's not just entirely a lecture um, course where I'm coming in with a topic, and then we spend, in fact, 2 hours just with you listening to me, and then that's not the way the course is designed. What we're going to do is there's going to be a bunch of questions we look at, and then address one of the readings that you want to look at over the topic that we are studying, and have a discussion on that text. So what we can probably do as we go through the manual is understand the way the topics are structured. There might be certain things that you might need more emphasis on, so that's something which we can discuss. That's not a problem. Evaluation, assessments, those things, I wanted to discuss all of those things today. There's specific assignment details for a few exercises, like there's an expectation of a sort of end-term book review, which is preceded by a chapter review of a text that you identify to read from the list of texts that are given. So the exercise details of that would be shared between anytime today and tomorrow. So you'll receive a separate email on that. But I didn't want to share everything on day one itself, because the idea was to first gauge what kind of assessment pattern most students would be also comfortable with, given the form of learning or the mode of learning. The other thing is, in terms of attendance and participation, there's a natural expectation, because of the diversity of topics you're covering, that you attend the class on days when it is scheduled. I know that on certain days there might be a particular reason for which you may not want to attend a course live, and may want to go through a recording. What the only challenge with that is, there's a lot being done at the time when the course or a topic is being discussed. Since you are deliberating on a text and there are questions, so even that aspect is going into your overall evaluation for the course. There is a particular grade that's assigned for participation, which is more in terms of what perspectives, what value addition you're bringing in. So I wanted to conceptualize much of the teaching of the course as keeping it as interactive as possible. There's a lot of perspectives disciplinary, spatial, context dependent to your own lived experiences that will come. And I think that is very critical, especially as the course evolves. While we may focus on specifically 1 and 2 country-based case studies, it's not an exhaustive list. You can bring different examples as we discuss a particular topic, right, for a particular class. So those are the few things that I wanted to sort of canvas out the very beginning. So if that's all right, we can just probably proceed. If you have any specific burning questions at this point, I can take that, and otherwise we'll get started. So good to go ahead. All right. Okay. So let me start by first looking a little bit at the title itself. I mean, the perspective here is to really see whether so in the field of political economy, the focus on political economy now has branched out into many different perspectives. You could look at study of elections. You could look at the study of regulation institutions. You could look at the study of the history of historical context of the evolution of times in reference to colonial nation states, and have that as its own specific root. But much of the common framework that is applicable in whichever perspective you pick in an interdisciplinary course like political economy, you would always talk about two entities, so as to speak: the nation state and the context in which the nation state works in its relationship with the market. These are two entities which, when you talk about the market, you're not seeing the market as just a market in its physical representation of a market that you would see, which is a particular geographical space which is demarcated as a market. But a market would be seen as anything which would allow for human beings to entertain or engage what you would consider as in the 3 instinctive abilities to truck, barter, and exchange. By trucking disposition, Adam Smith would generally refer to as mobility, any particular space which allows for free mobility, the ability of somewhere exercising double coincidence of wants, 2 people or more than 2 people sitting and exchanging things in terms of what each other desire or want. Those are instinctive tendencies that market spaces can allow for. And for that, it doesn't need to always be seen in terms of understanding a commercial exchange of goods and services, which is what modern technically capitalist systems tend to understand or relate market spaces as. At the same time, a nation state and its agencies could have a physical representation of itself through a government. At the same time, you can also see in Plato's conceptualization of the state to be seen more as the soul, which is impermanently there, independent of whether you have a government or you have a physical wing or not. There's a big debate in the informality context whether can informal spaces be seen as stateless spaces at all. In a lot of context in economies where the state regulation or organizational aspects of regulation do not fit, you have one of the ways of looking at those as stateless societies. But the state is pretty much present. There is, in fact, an order and an organizational structure or an institutional structure which makes those societies govern and organize themselves as well. To give you an example from, let's say, India, we have formal justice mechanisms through what is secured by the legislature, by the judiciary, and recognized by legislature and the executive in a sort of a Westminster parliamentary system. But you also have non-state means of many social institutional forms where justice mechanisms are served. One of those could be seen as a panchayat form of deliberation, and I will sort of maybe share with you an interesting link that might give you a reference. You can also access this from just a second. Yeah. Yeah. So this would give you a very good reference point to a sort of a non-state entity which is not recognized by the state, and still decides in its own customary sense. It has its own state law, customary law, and the way in which social arrangements, from issues of dispute settlement of marriages to many other things, are addressed. This is in a state in Haryana where the university where I'm based back in India is based, and without the rural presence of the Khap Panchayat, which is a term which is often used in describing them, lot of dynamics of local justice systems may not be served. Now, the state may not formally recognize Khap Panchayats as a dispute settlement mechanism or justice serving institution, but the role of norms, cultural attributes have made it such that it matters. Now, this is a big question. The reason I mentioned about this is that this is a big question now that there is closer endogenous or internalized outlook towards looking at economies as embedded systems of culture and social arrangements, as in its own sense. Particularly in post-colonial nation states, there is now a theoretical lens to widen perspectives which were seen or understood as the traditional political theory forms of knowledge systems. Now, the reason of mentioning this is because the 2 or 3 key questions we are looking at in context to the course is situated on understanding the role of the state. By role of the state, in the sense, how can you perceive the state or the nation state and its agencies in terms of the way they have been formed, created, decolonized to a certain extent, or have moved towards their own independent form and existence. The forces of colonialism, as I said, or the degrees of extensive colonial root of power, control, and command structures or institutional forms are very different from each of the countries. And as you look back into their past, and they give you a very good perspective. The study of that past or historical trend give you a very good perspective on their current structure and form. In whether it's on the relationship of factor endowments, that is, in relationship of land, labor, capital, technology, all of these, or if you look at from the perspective simply of social cultural settings, each of these require you to understand the evolution of the state, and then try to come in as you see with question 2, some kind of classified or categorized nature of state formations. So this is where Atul Kohli becomes very important as a person to read. I think he gives you a sort of a non-Western lens to understand countries with extensive or long histories of colonial past, how we can contextualize and categorize state formations in their regard. I mean, his book focuses a lot more on 4 countries at large: Brazil, Korea, India, and Nigeria. We would be looking more at the Indian context. Our reference to China would be more or less in the post-reform, post-Deng Xiaoping years, in just understanding how the Chinese state has evolved from what it was. But our context of understanding evolution of state forms with their historical knowledge or context is something which we are relying on Atul Kohli as one of the main reference points for reading. We move on then and this is all what we are doing in the first couple of weeks, is to understand the relationship of the state with the market, right? And much of political economy and the study of political economy or the study of institutions, regulatory practices, is about knowing the landscape in which the state and market relate or understand each other. Now, when I say state-market relationship, what comes to your mind? It's just a term. Does it relate to something which just that you can visually imagine or think of? Anything? So anything that comes to your mind when you think of state-market relationship, in any particular practice, in any particular area, whether it's sector that you're working in, whether it's a particular area that you might be looking at. Yes, anyone could go ahead.
So
Just unmute.
that would be the stock market, correct?
Okay, yeah. So how do you see the state market relationship playing out in the stock market in any way? I mean, when you say stock market, how do you see?
Well, I guess because it is impacted by the political structure, I mean, these days it's really the global structure, right? So it is, and it's informed by what is happening politically. So that is a relationship between, the political and the market.
Yeah, all right. Anyone else? Anything that comes to your mind when you look at? Yes, Peter?
Makes me think personally of the use of industrial policy in the development of countries like Korea. I feel like that's a state market relationship because I mean it's still mainly a market-based economy, but the state intervenes in order to sort of prioritize certain outcomes.
Okay. Just maybe also think in terms of a very basic day-to-day sort of lifestyle and life happening for you. I mean, where do you see aspects of the market intersect with that of what you know and understand as the state? Doesn't necessarily need to be sort of a grand macro sector or a country. Yes, Des?
I was thinking like the state through the government controlling prices of essential goods like food, vegetables, meat. They're sort of making like price caps for certain goods so that it would be more accessible for people.
Excellent. So why do you think the state does that? Why, or because a very sort of libertarian view would advocate that there's not much for the state to do there, right? Let markets sort of self-correct on their own. Prices represent, needs, wants of people. So is there a need to put any kind of restrictions or cap or ceiling of prices for any particular essentials? And if that's the case, why is that?
I'm thinking if the state lets the market determine the price, it would benefit more the like businesses, the traders who produce or deliver these goods to people. They probably want to profit more from it. So the state, the government, want to control that kind of profiteering done by the businesses.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Anything else that comes to mind when we talk about state market relationship in the way you? Yes, Marta?
I'm thinking healthcare here, for example, which is publicly funded. So that's a state market relationship that the public.
That's an excellent sectoral point. I mean, and particularly in the Canadian context, since a lot of what happens within healthcare would be seen all having a large umbrella of the state present in that space. But where does the market come in terms of deliverance or distribution or access to healthcare facilities? Where's the role for the market? If everything is being sort of governed, determined, provisioned for by the state, what's the space for the market to find its roots there?
I would need a second to think about that.
Yeah, no, I mean this is open to anyone. Because it's an excellent point. I mean, the two biggest changes post 1970s that's happened, and particularly it started a lot from the US, but then sort of spilled over across the world, was the privatization of education and healthcare, right? There's a brilliant paper by an economist, Kenneth Arrow, on sort of predicting the nature of pitfalls and issues related to the marketization or the marketification of education and healthcare. And he cautioned about those two being seen as the issues with public goods becoming more to be seen as private goods, and how accessibility would be a concern. And this, I mean, the study, which I think this is back in late 1960s, was so prophetic in nature, because much of what we are facing right now in the nature of human capital crisis, both I think I would say in much of the developed world and also now in the developing world, is a product of the extensive privatization of human capital. So yes, Steph, and then Marta, anything?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Sorry,
no, no.
Steph. Your name. Go ahead.
Yeah, it was just briefly, I think we see the market interact in the healthcare system, like kind of at the bookend where you have to pay for services like blood withdrawals, extra tests, like expedited laboratory tests, like they do maybe $5-10 charges sometimes. Medication, if you're over 25 and under, I think it's like 60. It's still heavily subsidized, but you have to pay. Privatized healthcare as well, if you don't want to spend like 14 hours in the emergency room and you don't have a family doctor.
Yeah, exactly. So that gives you perspective on. Marta, you wanted to sort of add something, and
Yeah, so touching on that, I was also going to say other services that insurances don't necessarily tend to cover, like dental. Sometimes not all insurances cover vision, prescription drugs, and all the ones that Steph was mentioning make space for the market.
okay, brilliant. Education. Anywhere in education where you could position this, particularly in systems where there is private provisioning, which allows markets to play a role in deciding? No? Okay. And one very good example, which is where I'm coming mostly from right now, is the UK. I mean, UK's higher education landscape has extensively been determined by the influx of international students. I mean, Ottawa also is not too different in that regard, but UK is a very big market for many international students, particularly a lot those coming from India and other large-scale developing economies who have English speaking skills. And the entire positioning of graduate programs have been pivoted towards the market needs of meeting to that international student audience. And it's a big revenue factor for universities, and that now has been disrupted by the nature of, I think, challenges imposed by restrictive immigration and sort of debates around countries looking back at how much of students they need and want from international regions. So it's all part of the same encapsulating umbrella of the debate, is what the point is here. So I hope these questions are clear. I just want to sort of look at these questions for you, which is the question on understanding the role of the state, the categorization of state formations based on historical trends or their colonial past, and the need to understand the state market relationship. So we will be sticking with these questions as our sort of main talking point for much of the first few weeks. In fact, when we start looking at the case studies of countries, you'll keep coming back to this question of how do you categorize that state, where and how, whichever sector you might be wanting to study. Peter mentioned about industrial policy. One of the big areas of studying industrial policy now is to situate it in context to understanding the nature of technological change, how technological change or the digital economic disruption, so as to speak, is reorienting our imagination and understanding of the state market relationship. There's a fascinating book, I don't know if it's mentioned in the manual, which is a book by Jean Tirole, that is Economics for a Common Good. Is it mentioned in the text? I think it might be, but if not, I'm just putting it out here for your reference. I think this was one of the first texts by Jean Tirole, which looked at the understanding of digital economic systems, but also explaining the regulatory or institutional challenges that are associated with that. Just a second, let me see if, are you getting the links that I'm putting in the chat box, guys? Yes. All right, so just you could probably take a look at this and give you a lens. All right, now I have something for you, and I want you to see something and tell me what comes to your mind as you see this image, and putting it in context to what we were just saying a while back. Anything that comes to your mind as you look at this image? Yes, Peter?
I guess it's a conductor conducting an orchestra. If we were to place in like a state market allegory, probably the conductor would be the state as like the one unitary actor at the front of the class, and then the orchestra
Yes.
would be the market, like a ton of different actors all individually contributing.
Okay. Did others follow this, which is what and who the conductor sort of represents here? If the conductor as an instrument or an agent of the state is right there conducting, and all others are sort of focusing on their own respective instruments, but what are all collectively doing? You all see in front of them, there's a common sort of piece of paper which is kept. What all are they trying to do at the same time? Which is produce or get or produce the same rhythm as much as possible of the notes of music that they're trying to learn, right? Now, this is one form of music, right, as a genre. An orchestra will give you a relationship, but what kind of a relationship would the conductor share with his or her musicians? What kind of a relationship would you see or imagine the conductor to share with his or her musicians? Yeah.
Probably a very one-sided relationship where the conductor conducts and everybody follows. I don't think there'd be much give and take.
Okay. And yes, Charlie?
You could also say that they're playing for an audience that is hearing everything, but doesn't really have an opportunity to participate itself. It's very much just getting what's given to it. You could also say that the different sections, whether it's like the brass or the woodwinds, act as a different service within the economy, whether that's education or healthcare, which is made up of individual actors that are still all working together under the umbrella of the conductor.
Yes, excellent. Charlie? Yes, Charlie, you were saying something. I could just see your hand up. Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry, that was me.
Oh, that was you. Sorry. Steph.
Yes.
I would say that the manager is supposed to, he knows the piece or the pieces in their entirety. I guess knows which sections are supposed to play louder in some moments and quieter in other parts. So
Steph, the wind is blowing stronger than your voice into the speakerphone.
Is this better?
Oh, much better, much better. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I was gonna say the conductor is kind of tasked with like the overall big picture because he knows the entirety of all of the pieces. I mean, so do the players, but he can kind of see the bigger picture, and he knows which sections should be played louder in some parts and quieter in others.
Marta?
Yeah, just to add on to what everyone's saying, so the relationship between each section also matters. So the kind of like respect they have for each other's roles and when to step back, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that that's also important. So the conductor can
Can
try to
you
make sure that is in harmony, but the different areas should also know to respect that.
can you say that the relationship here between the conductor and the musicians is one that is paternalistic in nature by its very form of the form and genre of music that we see here? Yes? If you-
First answer would be an easy kind of yes, because you have kind of one head at the front that's directing everything, but you also kind of need to have some sort of complicity. But it's a it's a question that deserves more dissecting. Yeah.
Yeah. Asya, go ahead.
So I can't help but put my feminist lens on this. I find it, problematic because it feels so it feels like it is being determined through just one perspective, and it feels like it's authoritative in essence, and it feels rigid. It feels that it's not really giving. I mean, they just have to follow. Like it feels like it does not give the flexibility that might be needed, because I'm comparing it to other forms of music. But that is going to be my lens on some
No,
of
no,
this.
absolutely. So actually and I want to sort of come to the point of why this image, right? Because the literature is very skewed towards what you would find is a libertarian paternalistic outlook towards state market relationship. The market here is being defined by the nature of skill set that each of the musician have. They find the reason to play that to their maximum level of comfort, but under the rules of the game set by this conductor. You see if you understand what I'm saying. Now, there is a lot of expectation to or of that market agent in order to participate in the exercise or adhere to the rules of the game, or by playing to those rules of the game, to produce the right rhythm of music. And now what quote unquote that right rhythm of music is being determined more or less by the nature, form, or aspect of the state that you see. And the only way you can understand here right now is in the state being personified by a conductor who is not actually carrying guns, arms, or is militarizing uh, the musicians. In fact, you don't see a gun in his hand, but just something which he's using as a want to manage time and conduct music. But the effect of disciplining is so regimented and regimental that you do see a paternalistic, severe outlook. And I was waiting for this sort of feminist perspective to come in, because much of the genre of music in orchestra. I mean, there was a beautiful film I remember watching a few years back, which had Kate Blanchett in it. Tar, T-A-R. I think that was and I don't know if anybody saw it. It made a fictional character of a woman conductor. In fact, it was on her life, and it showed you the ins and out of what happens in the orchestra music space, both learning and dissemination of knowledge. But going back to the state market allegory is to see this image as one where the state is being represented by in a command sort of control sector, which is shaping and creating all the rules of the game. And the market agents are supposed to sort of work under those rules. And those rules can be defined by rule of law, regulatory practices, whatever that may be the case. Now, in much of what you would define and understand as part of the industrialized West and developed country landscape, there is a natural expectation that some of the rules of those game as being part of either a citizen of the country or as being part of a sector that you're working in. I mean, it could be healthcare, education. Those rules can be something that you have to abide by when you're working. Of course, there are agencies and mechanisms of feedback loop embedded where you can share feedback, but at the end of the day, you have to sort of respect of what the state has provided and show. Now, does that present a very paternalistic view of the state? Absolutely. And that's where a lot of our literature, including in academic discourse, has been positioned. And it's not in any way different in political economy as well. Much so because a lot of political economy literature is also coming from political theory and classical sort of economic thinking. So that perspective of looking at things from a paternalistic lens is historically embedded. Doesn't mean one needs to agree with it. But let's look at another form of music which has absolutely no command structure in play, and you would find something very different that would be going about. Yes, Shivani, please go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to share my interpretation of the picture. I have a few bits and pieces of what I'm understanding in this, and I could be wrong. But I'm thinking about the conductor specifically. So I do think that it represents like a narrow political leadership, and it is deliberately that strategy that there's only one person conducting the whole choir, just to avoid any public debate, like a big debate. So the state can avoid more debates in the parliament or outside parliament. And then I'm also thinking, as Claire said, just to build up where there's a choir and then there's audience. So it's like a two-track democracy where one part of the audience only is used when there's, there's elections or there's an electoral process just to mobilize or use the votes. But then there's a choir which is trained specifically to influence mainly two things: investment and consumption, because consumption is the main factor in economic growth. I'm not sure if I'm understanding it correctly.
No, absolutely. This is great. So one of the things I have to say this, guys, there's no one way of looking at things. I mean, it's very important that I also mention I'm here to learn from each one of your perspectives, because the amazing thing about social sciences, which is also the worst possible thing in the area, is that the intersubjectivities override objective thinking. And I'm saying that as a trained economist, the illusion of mathematical axiomatic reasoning that there is one binary truth somewhere in causal interdependence is very overrated. So when you look at a particular question, when you look at a particular image, when you look at a particular reading, you would always, much like watching a play or being in a musical performance, you would enter into it from your own disposition of what you know. And there is something that you would take away from it would be very different. So, for example, I mean, it's interesting because it's an image which I often project, right? And a lot of different interpretations come based on what everybody interprets. And they do it from their own notions and understandings of what the image projects. So let's look at another form of music right here. And Shivani, all points well taken. I think you're spot on with being able to look at the projection of how the conductor would be seen as someone who's representing a larger entity, where the state and how the state functions. And one can find that to be authoritative, more paternalistic. It could also be that there's a lot of concentration of power in the hands of an individual person, but then there might be dissemination of or decentralization of power at the back end. We don't know. But let's look at another form of music, which, and I would sort of ask you to speculate, where there's not much of this command structure. Everybody, in fact, is pretty very free to do what they want to do with their instrument. And in fact, you see a lot of competition amongst the musicians, which produce its own form of music. And you don't see this working in the way that you see in the image that you have in front of you right now, which is very much more organized and sort of quote unquote neat. Anything that comes to mind as something which would be?
I'm just thinking, I'm not sure how will they be able to play the music and coordinate if
No,
everybody
there's
is
a lot
playing
of
their own.
chaos. I mean, this genre, which I'm asking most of you to speculate, is extremely chaotic in its musical structure. But you have a bunch of musicians, everybody's doing their own thing. And yes, Peter, yeah.
I'm assuming it's jazz.
Yes, absolutely. So in case of jazz, there would be less of predefined what you would consider as straitjacket normative rules of the game. In fact, everybody would sort of position themselves. Oh, it's a good time to talk about jazz. You have the Ottawa Jazz Festival going on, no? Right? This is the time. So yeah, so jazz would give you a very different interpretation of that relationship. In fact, the state would in fact be very less visible as in any form of a direct centralizing commanding entity in any way or form. You would have much more of a representation of a sort of a quote unquote free market entity where each musician is doing their own thing, and then you see their own form of music being shaped. So what's our focus? So drawing on upon that, what we want to do is sort of look at from post-colonial late sort of developing narratives, some of the critical political economy questions. And the questions going back to what I was saying would be to help you sort of interpret the role of the state. And I think it's a very important time, not just in international political economy or international relations, but just with the nature of events that you're seeing happening on a day-to-day basis, the whole sort of tectonic shift of existing rules of the game based on the Bretton Woods order, international financial institutions, international multilateral institutions, peace institutions or peace building networks. All of this are seeing what you would consider as a rapid chain. And that change is so seismic in nature that the ability to understand the evolutionary forms of nation state structures is very critical and vital, and almost it's conceptually or classically speaking, it's very timely to look at some of these questions. So the idea and objective, as I said, by looking at these questions, is to look at texts which can help us reason through things. Of course, the examples situated here are of what you'd consider as post-colonial nation states. You can always, I mean, also if you're well read on Canadian political and economic history, you can always relate, compare to what you read, and see how the Canadian story as a growth narrative is very different to what you would find with, let's say Australia or India, all having a common colonizer, but the degrees and the forms and the nature of colonial pasts are so different. If you add a Nigeria to that scenario, you'll find a completely different perspective. So it's critical to look at that, to the study of the past, to be able to understand the present, but also to be able to reason and see where the future beholds in understanding the contours of state-market relationship is something what we are trying to do here. So I would, at this point of time, ask you to do something which can also give you a little bit of time to sort of take a short break. But at the same time, what I'd request you to do is to read something and then sort of come back to me on what you understand, if that's all right. So all of you have access, I believe, to the course manual. Am I correct? If I can just if I can ask you to raise your hands, just so that we don't all have to speak, but no, just on the virtual raising of hands, which is, yeah. So I just want to know that if all of you have access to the course manual, right? There will be a Drive folder link which was shared. It was in the manual, and this has access to your readings as well. There's one reading in particular that I would like you to sort of look at this point, maybe, and take around sort of 20 to 25 minutes looking at that particular text. Which is the text on the introduction to state industrialization global periphery. Do you see this one? If I don't know if my screen is visible, can just one of you confirm? Yes. Okay, so I've seen most of you who have the course manual. But in any case, what I'm also doing is sharing the link of the text here, you guys. Okay. So if you click on this link, you would be able to also get access. So I've mentioned that all course related information which is mentioned in the manual is also accessible parallelly with this Drive folder. Okay, and I just want you to now next raise your hands if you have access to the text which I'm talking about, the text on Introduction to States and Industrialization. I think most of you, all of you have it. Reje, Marta, Katie, Jonathan, Ikram. Any update? So I'll just request you to raise your hand once you have access to the text that I'm asking you to look at. So what I want you to do is maybe just take around 6 minutes, just take a short break. What I would request you to do is please look at the first 15, and depends on everybody's reading speed, is to look at the introduction of the text, this particular reading. Just what you could do is, as you read through any terms, any things that you want to make notes of, any new concepts, words that you come across, you could just highlight those. But where I would give you some separate time, maybe around 10 minutes or so after the first 30 minutes go, is to make a short summary of what you have read in terms of what you understand. There's a specific question which you want to sort of more closely look at, which is on the nature of state formations the author talks about in this introduction. But come to that much later. Just try to first understand, read. Every text would be in its own form, very different in nature. I mean, these are all readings coming from different disciplinary contours. So just be patient with the text. I think engage with it as much as you can. And we'll be doing this actually more often in class. I'll always be giving you some part of a text to read and understand an aspect of it that we later on are able to discuss. So can we do this, please? Unless anybody has any observations, questions. Okay, so yes, so what you can just now turn off your virtual hands, please. Thank you. So I'll request you to, for the next 30 minutes, to just focus on the reading of this text, right, which you have in front of you. And if you have any questions in that meantime, of course, you can raise those, but maybe just use the chat box and write to me. That's also fine. And I'll give you separate some time for notes and summary writing, so that the 30 minutes lapse first. Okay, thank you. So I'll get a sense of how many of you. Okay, 60-70% people. Yeah. Okay. All right, that's fine. I think we could just sort of take it slowly ahead, and a lot of our initial conversation on Thursday would be positioned around these categories that the author is talking about, right? Which you would have read through. But I want to just quickly take a short feedback. Thank you. You could just sort of, how to put it, turn off your hands. Yeah. So yeah, I just want to know what your thoughts are, initial thoughts on what you read. Of course, anything on the text itself, anything that you had in mind as you were reading through it. It's the introduction actually to a book. So it's written that way. It's a lot more dense as it leads down the key concepts for each of the states that he's talking about. But it's helpful for us to start by making sense of those categories, which we will assess them in our own way. But yeah, any thoughts on the text? Steph, Peter, Marta, Luis, and then Asia, yeah. Okay. Yes, Asia, go ahead. And then maybe let me ask others to weigh in.
Okay, thank you. So I've not, I've often wondered about economies, but this is my first course, so I found it, just very interesting in terms of the impact of colonialism on these different countries and to the degree in which that had an impact on how they developed their economies, right? So the case of, because colonialism hit them in different ways and to the in different degrees. I mean, of course, I only know I'm from Pakistan, so I know a little bit about the subcontinent impact of colonialism, and so the interest and my interest is in India and its economy, and that is really sort of my area of focus that I'm interested in, how colonialism impacted it, and so the three different economies that we see and how the state organized itself based on those features, and also some of the ways in which they embarked on this had to do with the pre-work that was done during colonialism, right? So it's all, things don't get created in a vacuum, but are interconnected. And so how they were functioning before had an impact on how they organized themselves post-colonial.
Yeah, excellent. Sorry, I'm also seeing some hands raised. Shivani, yes, please go ahead, and then let me ask others to weigh in.
Yeah, my thoughts, I was just thinking how I usually thought there was a standard cause for why reforms were made in 1991, like the economic crisis or the deteriorating balance of payment situation. But then it's interesting because the text talks about some of the other external factors, where it talks how the Cold War also had a direct impact, economic impact, like the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And its decline, where India's defense needs suddenly became linked to its ability to earn hard-earned money, a hard currency, and like for example in the U.S. dollars, to improve export earnings and manage the foreign exchange became issues of national security. And then it talks about how there was growing availability of investor resources, where money was looking to go in form of portfolio investments. And then also anticipation of the WTO. So I didn't actually think about those concepts earlier, but it was interesting how I learned through the text. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Ikram?
Yeah, I found I kind of, this was always my my thinking that there's one way of doing things, the neoliberalism, how it's pushed on developing countries. And I found the text very interesting in the way that it rejects this binary way of thinking, that how it's not about state intervention, it's about if the state is organized enough to intervene. And so I find this very interesting.
Interesting. Okay. Anyone else? Any thoughts, reflections based on what you read? Anything that comes to your mind? Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd actually read a chapter of this for another class, specifically a chapter on Korea, and it was interesting.
Sorry.
Reading the intro now because I feel like they're more broadly understood. For example, as prevention or pre-industrialization, I thought was a very interesting point. I found it interesting that the author sort of presented this dichotomy between like the late industrializers for whom state intervention is more important and like the earlier spontaneous industrializers, specifically England, because I've read, I'm thinking specifically a book by Ha-Joon Chang called Kicking Away the Ladder, which talks about how even for England, it was still a very interventionary process, heavily focused on like industrial policy and protectionism economically.
Yeah. In fact, see, the use of the word periphery is now very problematic amongst political theorists. I'm just saying that Atul Kohli is sort of the, I wouldn't say that much of his writings, classically, a lot of them help you categorize, classify things with more nuance and complex layering of bringing historical insights into understanding formation of states and sort of looking at non-Western categories of state formation. By the West, basically avoiding Eurocentric or in a certain sense US or American imagined views of how the world order shaped over time, and it's particularly post 1945 period. So he gives you a good, I think, as in terms of its writing perspectives that one can adopt. But a lot of the ways of using sort of, terms like late industrializers, late development, or so as to say, also you have a core and then you have a periphery. That aspect has now been severely, critiqued in the way of where you position yourself, right? For example, we may be talking a lot about Middle East, but one of the things in India often you'd see is that the conditioning of talking about Middle East as Middle East is so strong that you don't see it as West Asia, which is actually the geographical point of direction from where you have to really see it. And the relationship of the subcontinent or the region historically is extremely different with West Asia and how it has formed and shaped itself. So those kind of narrative projections in the world we live in, I think it's very important. So where I find and you would, Marta, please go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see your hand. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to share my thoughts on the text as well.
Yes,
I've also
please.
read the text for a different class. A key point that Kohli makes that I think is very interesting is how hard it is for institutions to change, which then we can tie into how unfair certain policies that are inflicted on the global south, and then blaming them for the failure of those policies without understanding how those institutions were formed in the first place due to colonialism is kind of like a double standard. But those were my initial thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Yes, Peter, please.
I also just had a quick question about terminology. I notice he says not just late industrialization, but late industrialization. I'm curious what the second late is referring to.
That would be post 80s or early 90s. The late would generally be positioned the sort of period of time. Generally speaking, post the fall of the Berlin Wall, or the sort of looking at the Washington consensus sort of adopted models of supply side. The word, neoliberal also has its own connotation. So use word supply side economics in that sense, which argue for a certain kind of economic growth model. So that would be seen more in that light. And the other key point which is critical, and we'll discuss more on these categories. I want to just sort of put this out in perspective from from the presentation we were looking at, which is the three forms of categories. So the question we are looking at, so I mean, for those who might have just gone through the text for the first time and may need a little more time to just absorb the text better. I mean, what I'm going to do, particularly in the Tuesday class, is sort of start a discussion with one or two core texts in mind and share some anecdotal thoughts. A lot of the discussion based on what you've read between the sort of the Tuesday and Thursday class would make a lot of sense in the discussion on Thursday, because everybody has different reading capacity. So when you look at a text, you may not be able to just very quickly share perspectives and thoughts on what you had in mind. Having said that, the manual, which I'll sort of also walk through in a bit, tells you very specifically which text we are looking at across what class and topic. So this is the question we are first dealing with, which is the category or classification of state formations. I mean, that emerging from what you would have read is branched out in three particular categories. So the starting of our sort of Thursday class would look at each of these categories. What I'd request you to do is look at these categories and have a few characteristic features identified from the text. You could definitely use the reading by Kohli as your sort of benchmark text, but also, use your imagination to bring perspectives on what other nation states could fit in those. So these are, first of all, transient definitions. By the word transient definitions, you can't have a fixed rigid jacket of saying, oh, this is a neo-patrimonial state, this is a cohesive capitalist state, and this is a fragmented multi-class state. These are three categories. They have all different characteristic features, which the author talks about in pretty much detail. But what he's doing is basically is helping you conceptualize and understand each of the countries he's taken as case studies in the book. Okay. But those are not exhaustive cases. There will be cases of other countries which will fit in those descriptions, in those characteristic features as well. Also, there are countries at different periods of time which are demonstrating different kinds of characteristic features. Like, I mean, giving you the reference point of South Asia at large, you'll have features of countries giving you perspectives of all. A neo-patrimonial state, in part a fragmented multi-class state. So you have to be very clear in what period of time and in what perspective are you thinking of an illustrative example while describing these categories. So here is what we are doing. As I said, for Thursday, we start with our discussion around these categorizations that the author speaks of. You want to have a few notes on each of these characteristic features. That's all there in the reading. But just read on one of the cases that you can better understand to be able to speak about that. I mean, that one reference point is in the text itself, but if you have another example, that's always wise to sort of think about where you're coming from. So that's where we're headed, just for you all to know. So any questions on this as part of what I've just said? All right. Okay. And let me just move now to the course manual ones, and this will, sorry. Yeah, so what I want to do by looking at the document, which you would be seeing in front of you, would be to able to just make sense of what we are doing really across the weeks. There's a lot of other information, which is just procedural, that you would get access to. I mean, there are references of readings. So I know when I usually teach this or any such courses in or outside a particular geographical area, I just add a few reference readings for those who need more context information. I mean, it's not as if all our examples are coming only from India or for that matter from South Asia. The idea here is really for you to bring your own examples and share those. In fact, I'd urge you to sort of really think about, I mean, somebody mentioned Haiti, somebody mentioned Morocco. You have different spatial experiences and context with the one which you're most familiar with. I mean, it could be also coming from your space within Canada of what you've observed, but why that is critical is because with each topic and reference, particularly as we'll move from nation state focused discussions to markets, these are very conceptual, classical points of deliberation. So it's not really specific to any particular country or area, geographically speaking, right? We then, of course, move to India briefly and then talk about China. So I've mentioned of some texts that will be helpful. For those who are just interested broadly in political economy, I mean, there are a lot of people who do political economy now across disciplines, which may not be part of a core political economy area, but this interesting Oxford handbook, which is pretty easily accessible now online, is often helpful as well. You can see the screen, right? Well, otherwise I'm just aimlessly highlighting. Okay. There is a very interesting text on China, which I would definitely say if you haven't read so far, it's one of those fewer, I think, texts written by a scholar who's not from sort of the native space of looking at the Chinese political system, but has written extensively on understanding the state philosophy and structures of state formation in the Chinese context. So you might as well sort of start gradually taking a look at it. For India, of course, this is usually a good reference text to start your work on. But for those who liked what you read in Atul Kohli's descriptive context, Kohli also has those 3 chapters in India, which are very interesting. And I would definitely urge you to look at the Nigerian case as well, because it's very interesting for those who've been in sort of reading through British colonial history or having read colonial history in the Canadian context, at least part of it, which is from the British sort of spectrum. You'd find the Indian and the Nigerian examples to be very uniquely placed in terms of the degrees of state intervention of the colonial power, and also experiments with state formation. And by the words experiments, I mean the nature of induction of drugs, medical experiments that was taking place by the British colonial state in parts of Nigeria and those things. They're very well sort of written about and extensively researched by economic historians now as well. So you'd find some interesting reference. This is a text called In Search for Prosperity, which I often use even while teaching some critical and discussions around growth narratives in the Indian context as well. It's an edited volume by Danny Roderick, again, a bit dated. I mean, most of these texts do not stand scrutiny of giving you a reflection of the last sort of 5 to 10 years. And that's okay, because conceptually, you're just sort of trying to make sense of the past. And so that's very helpful. I did mention of Economics for a Common Good for those who are looking at the sort of modern digital sort of economy, state system reference. This is on texts. There's some additional readings, again, which are more specifically on Asia, India, and China. So for those interested, you can just read the description or the introduction and decide for yourself. Now, I want to just quickly move to the topics and then sort of the assessment formats so that everybody's aware of what we are doing. And then if you have any questions, guys, just unmute and speak. I can't see your names popping up. So yeah, so with lecture 1 and 2, so what we were doing today, I mean, our main focus is actually on this text. I'll always have an additional reading, which I have a tendency to pack in for a particular week, this is talking about the schools of thought in international political economy. So I'll see how we're doing on time on Thursday and sort of maybe bring this part of our conversation there. But if you can finish what you were reading today and are better prepared with your sort of illustrative references to each of the state categories, you could skim through this one before your next class. It talks about the two dominant perspectives in political economy, mostly embedded in the British and the American form. But one, I think there's a critical missing link, so I'll talk about this when we connect on Thursday. The next week's, I think, classes are very much centered around, again, these two readings in particular. They're both very, I would say, deeply conceptual in nature, in the sense there is jargon. This is a paper, actually, which talks about Adam Smith's sort of perspective on markets and competition. But for those not comfortable in looking at the mathematics of it, it's absolutely okay. You just need to make sense of what the text is principally looking at as key questions or aspects of what the author is saying. So without getting too swayed by the methodological contours of the reading's explanation, what I would say is just look at the introduction first to get a sense of where the author is scoping much of his or her argument, and then start reading through that. So that's with this paper. Market failure and government failure is a landmark, I think, benchmark reading. It's from Journal of Economic Perspectives. It's a long essay, but I usually suggest that you take one look at this, at least in one good hard look at this. So this is for the next, of course, week, but that's going to sort of help us understand this third question on the understanding of state market dichotomy. We're looking first at state formations and then move towards the market. So that's on week sort of one split out between two. We'll then move on by discussing the context and role of growth narratives. This is something we'll start from Danny Roderick's book. Again, it has an introductory chapter, which is very interesting. It's very different, of course, in its writing form and structure from what you would have read earlier. But here we'll start diving into cases. We'll look at specific cases of countries. So you'll have an example. So here, in fact, I would push you to look at cases which you find to read or want to read more on. It may be about Indonesia. It could be about Botswana. It could be about countries which you otherwise may have had very limited knowledge, contextually speaking. And that's the whole point, right? With as much as you want to sort of look at your own. But if you're looking at a country like one which you want to situate in terms of your own reading, whether it's India or sort of Korea or anyone, you could pick that. And interestingly, this book has cases on each of these countries. So we'll talk about that as we go there.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. Are you planning on having a class on the 1st of July?
No, so there is no class on 1st of July. I've just mentioned it because week.
All right.
Because 30th June and 1st of July, it's the day off, right? So
All right.
it's Canada.
Perfect. Thank you.
July. So I'd be speaking to an empty discussion point, nothing most. So 1st July, there is no class, absolutely. So we'll connect on. So I'll have a few things that I'll spell out on Thursday, which I'd request for the class just do before they come in for the next class. But as of right now, what I'm doing is I'm just walking you through what and how topics look like. So we then move a lot to the Indian course. Now, the three people you're just mostly reading on India. One is Tirthankar Roy, again, not a very mainstream author people tend to read. Tirthankar Roy is an economic historian. He's written extensively on the Indian subcontinent, but he's written also a lot on colonialism and development, its relationship. So there are a few texts that we look at there while being able to make sense of the Indian growth narrative. It's very difficult talking about India in just maybe perhaps 2 or 3 sessions. It's a long period to cover, but there are certain aspects we'll pick out which we would be more interested in studying. There's a presentation I do, which is something I generally do on the challenges of the Indian economy in the current context, and that is more of a sort of a data based reflection of the structural concerns. So that is done towards the last sort of discussion on India. We move then on China, and then sort of in the last class go back and do a recap of what we have learned across the board by looking at each of these cases. Of course, as I said, with each reading, the context of the nature of our argument changes based on what we are looking at. Some cases, the discussions are a lot around growth and development journeys and pathways or institutional focus discussions. It could be a lot about looking at also things around social policy or gaps in, let's say, gendered participation of labor force rate. Like one of the challenges I look at in the Indian context is the low female to labor force participation rate, which unlike in China, where both countries were at the same level in the late 80s and early 90s, China now has over 70 to 80% of female to labor force participation rate, while in the Indian context, it's barely above 35 to 37%. And those are important issues in explaining, understanding the model of growth and the pattern of growth in its sectoral composition, right? Which has sort of ignored jobs for women in the organized sector. There are a lot of issues with labor market data and all of those things. So we'll look at that, but I do discuss those issues while talking about each of these countries. Now, there are a few things around evaluation, which I think is important to put in context. I mentioned about participation. My only request is if you can just sort of show up and be there for those 2.5 hours. I think that's the least we can sort of manage and do. But since we'll be looking at texts in class, some of these, what I'd request you to do is please just keep those 2 to 3 hours of your time relatively free, less for disturbance, and just engage with knowing more about a particular topic. There's no need to be, reluctant to speak or shy about anything that you have to offer and suggest. I mean, most of us are all learning with what we are getting to know. I mean, the world around us is also it's humbling, because what we are seeing right now happening in the global sphere in large, it's good for us to know that nothing is too fixed and rigid. So there's a lot to absorb, and it would be good for you to share your own thoughts as much as it's coming from your own personal lived experience, or also something what you want to share as an observation. So there are two main group focused assignments I do want to sort of mention about this. One is a virtual group presentation exercise. Now, this is an exercise where it would require some of you to connect with each other. Maybe maximum you would have is one or two group members where you would connect with each other to work on the assignment. It will be a virtual task in the sense that you would have a recording of a presentation you would work towards along with a brief. And details of this you can expect before Thursday, because what I'm trying to do is just now put groups in place. They will be randomly put together. There is an expectation for this assignment to be your first submission. It would be drawn out more closely with what we are doing in class, at least in terms of what we've started. But just wait for more details to be shared with you, I think, in the next 24 hours or so. The simulation exercise is something which is a sort of a benchmark evaluation I do with all my courses. I think it's standard across the board. It's a role play where you have a set of hypothetical situations and you're responding to those situations based on what is shared as a bunch of details. Now, the only thing where you're a little bit left out in the dark is with the simulation exercise, in the sense you will only be shared a document a week before when this exercise is due, and you have roughly that week as a team to work together. The simulation exercise requires you to present on what your respective organization or country or institution, that you're representing its statement in class, and you present through that. But then you can have breakout rooms where there would be certain points of information shared with you which you're responding all during class hours. But there is an expectation of doing a lot of background work in the simulation, and it's your final evaluation for the course. This is your basically your last class. The reason I mentioned of that first is this is the exercise of which you will have no initial information on. You would not know what the simulation is until a week before. Everything else you would know between now and the next 24 hours. You'll have a list of books for your chapter review and end-term book review as options that would be shared, which you can pick up any one for as part of your reading for the end term and chapter review submission. There's an attached document which will be defined as an academic writing template. A lot of people who need some kind of inputs, suggestive, almost prescriptive on writing essays or reviews will find that helpful. But otherwise, on reviews for those who have already done book reviews or a set of chapter reviews for any submission of an assignment, you'll know this already. So the list of titles for books that you can choose, again, this will be a separate document, which I will share along with your group presentation exercise as well. So all of this will come in the next 24 hours or so. So before your Thursday class, you would know everything. How does this look? Now, there's an expected date for your end-term book review, which is mentioned here as 3rd August, okay, which is like end of your course. I don't know if there is a specific week for submission because this was not informed to me, but if you know of it, you can tell me. If there's a specific week where all of your summer evaluations are coming through. Is that so? Or is it just all based on the course and the timeline of the course? For those who've done summer courses would know better, I think.
Yes, there is finals period, and generally it's after the course. So I think they haven't released the dates yet, but I think the last date is August 4th, I think.
August 4th, yeah. So my anticipation was somewhere around 3rd and 4th August. So the reason I'm mentioning about this as the date is because if you pick and identify your book now, you find in terms of having 6 weeks to go through that. What you're doing in the chapter review is basically picking out a couple of chapters from the same book and writing a review for which there is some feedback that's shared with you. It helps you write towards the end term submission. So you're with the same text, but you're writing, basically you're engaging with that text in 2 forms, one through chapters, the other as a whole book. So the evaluative measures for the course and its timelines are more or less listed here. I mean, more or less everything else is all procedural and just things that have to be there in the manual, I believe, for what is required to be needed. On writing, of course, it goes without saying the use of AI or just sort of uncited text, and those things need to be avoided. But just make sure when you're submitting things, they're all in proper shape and format. There is penalization, of course, on delayed submission. So a lot of those things are all in the manual. So I don't want to sort of go through that one step at a time. But if you have any questions, it would be good to know and accordingly address. Yes, Asya, please go ahead.
So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the end term book review and the chapter review. So will you be giving us a list of books to choose from, or are they
Yes.
already? Okay, you will
No.
be. All right.
There's a separate document you will have which says chapter
Okay.
review and end book review submission exercise. I wait to do that because I take first the consent of the class if they're okay being evaluated this way before somebody says that there is any issue in being evaluated through a virtual policy simulation or a group presentation. So that's I wanted to first walk everyone through this. This is what I had in mind, and take your feedback and then just sort of move accordingly. Yes, Ikram, please.
The policy simulation, is it an individual exercise or a group exercise?
So there are two group exercises, as I said. One is the presentation and the other is the policy simulation. The group constitutions for both are different. It will not be the same group. So, and the group by group, I mean barely one or two more people, because it's not a big class. The idea is to have you working with at least one or two people in the team. I think see it also as a way, because you're not connecting in person during the class. This is perhaps the only way you would engage with each other through evaluative measures. But I hope that isn't the case. We get a chance to share more when we're having in-class interactions. So yes, that would be the answer to your question, if I make sense. So it's a group exercise. The only assignment, as I said, you have no information on is your simulation. You just, I think, let this be till a week before, which is roughly what, 24th of July. You'll get everything and you have 1 week, you work on that, and that will take much of your time. It's interesting because what you would find is that your end-term book review, which is due roughly around 3rd of August, I feel that much of your review writing should be in place before you're doing your as in your simulation. You should just leave some part of your fine-tuning of the text towards the last few days. But if you leave everything towards the last minute, you will have a bit of a sort of a chaotic nightmare getting a review written in 2 days time of a text you would have read through. So just plan your work accordingly, and you should be okay. Yes, please.
Will you be assigning the groups for this one as well?
Yeah.
Or do we choose the group?
For the simulation, you mean? For the
Yes.
simulation exercise? Yeah. But it will be different from, again, randomly, but not the same as the same group for your group presentation. Okay. Shivani?
Yes, I had a question on chapter review. So I'm assuming that there would be a word limit for chapter review, but then does
Yeah.
it make any difference in the evaluation if we write on one chapter or more than one chapter?
No, so you would know exactly how many chapters you're supposed to review. It's basically between either 2 or 3. I think I've mentioned somewhere in the manual about, I think 2 chapters, right? There can be any 2 chapters identified from the book, either in succession or randomly from table of contents. And so the chapter review submission is very, I mean, the word limit is of course different from your end term review. The reason of asking you to do a chapter review so that one gets a sense of the direction in which you're going, in terms of how you're reviewing a text, what's your understanding, and then you stay in, get feedback on that, and you stay in with the same text for writing the end term book review. So basically on one book, you're being evaluated for what you choose. 45% of your grade is on that, if you see and make sense of that. 45% is mostly on group based work. And for what you're doing in class, for how you're engaging with readings, topics that we are doing, that goes in more intersubjectively on class participation. Anything else? Anyone? Yes, Shivani? Or your hand is still up. So
Yeah, I apologize. No, thank you.
anyone else? Okay, seems like, okay, I think we did fine for day 1. Our classes would usually be not as long as this one. I know it's not easy sitting in for the entire length of the period, but what I try to do is break the class in having one part of the discussion at first on a topic, and then have a particular text which you're reading through, and then have a discussion on that. So mostly my effort would be that between 10:45 to 11 we close, right? So I think we are at 11, right? Yeah. So we're fine. Anything else? Okay. The process of roll calls, guys, is that I'm able to do it at different hours. All right. So thank you. We'll connect on Thursday. Were you okay with the mode of the class today, guys? Any feedback on Am I audible? Anything you would want me to change? Just to let me know if everything is making sense. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.